And can folks now see some PowerPoint? Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I'm really excited to be here. I have a couple of things to kind of start us off. And so I'll just get going. Okay, so I have three things before I officially begin. The first, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I'm really grateful for all of you. It's been a busy week on my end. I imagine you all are in the same boat, so I appreciate it. Second, I just want to name this. I'm coming to you from the United States, and it's been a really weird few weeks to do scholarship. And a lot of my time as I have been trying to finalize this talk has been a little bit, been a little distracted. And so that's not really, I don't have a ton to add there. It's been feeling strange not to name it. So I figured I would name it to kind of get us started. More relevant to what I'm about to talk to you all about today, I have been working on questions about interpretive charity for over 8 years now. But this aspect of my project was a chapter of my dissertation several years back. But other than that, it hasn't been peer-reviewed stage. And so I'm really excited about it. But as I wrote this talk, I predictably arrived at a lot more questions than I can hope to answer here today. And in classic academic fashion, the more I thought, read, and wrote, the further away I moved from what I originally planned to argue. So to give some context for what I'm hoping for today, I welcome any and all questions, feedback, and suggestions for further reading. Throughout this talk, I'll flag some specific questions that I'd like some help thinking through, and I, of course, welcome ones that I haven't yet considered. I plan to speak for about 30 minutes, and I tend to speak fast when I'm a little nervous or excited. So if you all are like, wait, what is she saying? You can type in the chat, hey, slow down, and that is fine with me. Okay. So today I'm going to bring charity's etymology into focus, or that's my goal. And the reason I'm doing that is because, in my view, ignoring charity's etymological connection to love or kind of gesturing to it uncritically or nominally actually depoliticizes charity in a potentially problematic way. In my view, when we ignore charity's past or appeal to it, but just on a surface level way, we are hiding the fact that charity is always already political and that it's often used as a way to reproduce an epistemically unjust philosophical status quo. And I'll pause here and say, I know that this is an interdisciplinary group, but I'm coming at this very much as a philosopher, kind of thinking about how charity is functioning in academic philosophy itself. So to explain that rather dense kind of thesis, I will make 3 points. I'll try to do 3 things here. First, I'll say a little bit about the etymology of the word charity. And this may be review for some folks, but hopefully I've added something new or something interesting. Second, I'll describe 2 ways that I've seen non-specialists relate to charity's etymology and explain how each one depoliticizes charity in a way that can result in epistemically unjust demands for charity. And finally, I'll offer 2 paths forward, 2 ways kind of to sidestep this depoliticizing move. And then I'll offer some questions that I have for you that I'm still kind of working through. Okay. But before I go too much further, I am going to say a little bit more about how I came to this work and where my focus lies. So I've been working on charity for quite a bit of time, but not quite from the same angle as the work I've seen so far in argumentation theory. And I'm really grateful to Kat for sharing a lot of this work with me and for bringing me into this argumentation theory conversation about charitability. I'm interested primarily in the call for charitable interpretation rather than the practice of charitability or reading charitably itself, or arguing charitably itself. I have a lot to say about the practice of charitable argumentation, but what has really interested me from the jump was this really persistent habitual call that philosophers in particular seem to make for charitable reading, charitable arguing, charitable communicating. So furthermore, I'm most interested in what I'm calling non-specialist uses of charity. And by that, I mean something like folks who don't work on charity in their scholarship, folks who are using charity but are not like publishing papers about it. This focus has allowed me to think through the ways that philosophers of all methodological orientations are directed toward and by expectations of charitable interpretation, argument, and engagement. My interest in questions of charitability emerges from my suspicion that there exists in academic philosophy what I have come to call a charitability gap, such that marginalized or oppressed philosophers receive insufficient levels of charity while also being disproportionately expected to offer that charity. So on the one hand, I suspect that philosophers are willing to grant a disproportionately high amount of charity to already dominant philosophy or philosophers, as compared to the amount of charity that we give marginalized philosophy or philosophers. On the other hand, I suspect it is likely that those philosophizing from the margins will be labeled as unable or unwilling to read charitably, and will have our work's legitimacy questioned as a result of the assumption that we cannot or will not be charitable. This gap, both in who we grant charity to and who we expect charity from, reinforces the disciplinary status quo and reproduces epistemic and affective oppression, which helps preserve philosophy status as a discipline that is, to use Charles Mill's language, conceptually and demographically dominated by whiteness and by maleness. So that is some of how I'm situated and what motivates me in this work. I'm thinking about the call for charity made by non-specialists, folks who are not experts in charity or charity studies. By those not working on charity, those who take charity as a basic methodological principle, but who seem to habitually and uncritically call for charity from their interlocutors. Okay, enough table setting, let's get into it. Let's do some etymology. So in his overview of the terms charity and the principle of charity, the philosopher Petru Bijan explains that the English word charity is preceded by the Latin word caritas. And I apologize if this is review for some of y'all. I want to make sure I'm covering my bases. I'm not assuming too many things. So the word caritas translates to love, or in theological context, it refers specifically to love for one's neighbor or for one's community. To give a little bit more specific of an example, philosophers might know, or scholars might know, the word caritas through the work of Saint Augustine. On the Augustinian view of caritas, the quote, meaning of all scripture is charity or love. An interpretation that does not promote love is wrong. And conversely, it is right if it does so, even if the author did not intend it to be so. So for Augustine, the hermeneutic of caritas eliminates errors in interpretation and helps avoid hubristic or self-centered interpretation. To study and interpret scripture, for Augustine, requires approaching that scripture with a loving or a charitable spirit. In the first book of On Christian Doctrine, Augustine explains that charity is, quote, the motion of the soul toward the enjoyment of God for his own sake, and the enjoyment of oneself and one's neighbor for the sake of God. End of quote. And in his book, Understanding and Rationality, Oliver Schultz explains that for Augustine, the presence of caritas in interpretation, quote, becomes the criterion for whether the scripture has been understood. Augustine says, according to Schultz, so whoever believes to have understood the whole scripture, or at least some of it, but does not build up that double love for God and for others through this understanding, does not understand it. End quote. So Augustine is what we might call a hermeneutic objectivist. He believes that the interpreter of scripture must, by necessity, practice charity in order to correctly interpret scripture. Any understanding of scripture requires that the interpreter perform this love of God and neighbor for God's sake and not for one's own pleasure. One must be motivated by this love and must be searching for that love within the text. And this love for Augustine is a collective love. Caritas, actually, to me, my modern ear, seems to have more in common with the English word solidarity as we use it today than it does with charity, as in giving to charity or donating, something like that. But this connection between charity and love can be found even in pre-Christian and early Christian Greek. The word agape, in addition to being translated into English as charity, was also translated into love, which might be more familiar. That's how I typically kind of see it rendered. This love, as we likely all know, is not romantic, because we would normally translate romantic or sexual love as eros. But rewinding a bit to narrow the focus on agape, as Greek terms came to signify Christian concepts, agape was used to refer to God's love for man, and that was gendered language that we find there, and man's love for God and for his neighbor. Interestingly, agape was translated into two separate Latin words to distinguish between the active and the passive versions of this unconditional love. So actively, it was translated as delectio, and then passively translated as caritas. So to be charitable in this exegetical tradition is to passively harbor unconditional love for the person or persons to whom one is charitable. So the word charity kind of focuses on the other who is receiving the love in this grammatical kind of structure. Later, and I know that I'm like glossing, zooming through the history of various languages, but for the sake of time and my own lack of ability to speak languages like French, I'm going to jump to English. I apologize for that. But later, much later, agape was translated as love rather than charity in English versions of the New Testament. Oh, and that comes from the OED. So although agape eventually came to refer to love rather than charity, for roughly 1200 years, agape was translated in both ways. Perhaps as a result, or partly as a result, the Christian connotation of the word caritas seems to have carried over into English charities, early uses anyway. In other words, early uses of charity in the English language appear rooted in notions of Christian love. One definition of the term offered by the Oxford English Dictionary characterizes charity in the following way, and this comes after kind of a long list of other definitions that explicitly are religiously connected. But here they say that charity is, quote, a disposition to judge leniently and hopefully of the character, aims, and destinies of others, to make allowance for their apparent faults and shortcomings, large-heartedness, but often amounts barely to fair-mindedness toward people disapproved of or disliked, that being appraised as a magnanimous virtue. I grew up in the southern US, and so this definition reminds me of what we mean when we say, bless their heart, for being charitable. So this definition here, while it does not mention God or Christian love, appears, according to the OED, to be rooted in a sense of Christian love of God and fellow people, as we find in agape and caritas. In fact, while this is perhaps the general definition that comes closest to charity's philosophical or argumentative connotation, it comes third in the OED's account of the word, as I mentioned before. So we've got this etymological link between the word charity and the word love. By contrast, charity as it is used in philosophy today, usually by those not specializing in charity scholarship, typically refers to the practice of giving an author or an interlocutor or an argument the benefit of the doubt, or interpreting their argument in the strongest way reasonable, as I'm sure that folks on this call kind of are already aware. Yitzhak Melamed, quoting a paper on Spinoza by Edwin Curley and George Walsky, offers my favorite formulation of charity because it always makes me laugh. And this is the way that he sees charity operating among historians of philosophy. Quote, our default attitude should be such that we try to avoid ascribing radical and implausible views to great dead philosophers, end quote. Something like very on the nose there. So, although it's beyond the scope of this talk today to explore charity's etymology in further detail, this brief exploration has allowed me to identify the term's connection to notions of love. For much of history, a charitable attitude is not merely one of generosity or benevolence. Instead, it's an act of love. Now, there's plenty to say about the risks and violences of doing something in the name of love. I don't mean to say that like, oh, charity is awesome because it's connected so closely to love. We can see all sorts of violences, colonial violences, racist violences done out of a sense of love or a misplaced sense of love. But I find this connection really, really interesting and helpful for my thinking. I'll also note here that if you find this etymology interesting as well, Paul Van de Velde, actually another philosopher at Marquette, published an incredibly helpful book called The Ethics of Interpretation that delves much further into theological hermeneutics, the connection between Davidson and Gadamer's work on charity and openness, and just the principle of charity in general. So I highly recommend that for a much deeper dive than I can get to here. Okay, so all of this might seem like a moderately interesting but innocuous observation about the shift in a term's usage over time. After all, there are many words whose contemporary uses diverge sharply from what they originally meant. My personal least favorite example is the word literally in English. Shifted over time, and now I can't tell what it means. So what's the problem? Are we just using charity now differently than we did then? What's the point of you telling me about agape love and caritas? Well, that brings me to part two. The problem is that the widespread deployment of charity as a supposedly neutral, ahistorical, and apolitical method for arguing, interpreting, and communicating. That's the worry that I have, that's how we're using it now. And I'll pause here briefly to say that argument theorists and historians of philosophy also point to the term's ambiguity. And we can talk about that in the Q&A, but that's not going to be my focus here. So think about how you've heard calls for charity made maybe in your own professional or academic lives. Cat Stevens actually in her 2021 paper mentions that the first chapter of a lot of critical thinking textbooks will kind of mention interpretive charity as a basic principle for arguing well, and then kind of move on from there. So as long as you're being charitable, you can then learn to think critically. Or to cite my most recent encounter with the call for charity, in his widely used How to Read Philosophy handout for first-time philosophy students, Dave Concepcion suggests that, quote, fair-minded readers will practice the principle of charity. According to the principle of charity, one should give one's opponents the benefit of the doubt. One should respond to the best thing that someone who disagrees with you could say, even if they didn't notice it, end quote. So students are supposed to assume the argument's strength in order to accurately understand the material that they're reading. And I get that. In fact, I just taught this essay of Concepcion's a couple weeks ago. So I'm not here talking to you about like, here's all the problems with calls for charity, we should get rid of them. I'm just kind of trying to think through the work that they're doing in our discipline. And my worry that I'm trying to articulate here is that when we ignore charity's etymology, we rely on the concept of charity uncritically and do not attend to the political nature of charitability. And sometimes it seems like love, any form of love, caritas or not, doesn't really have anything to do with what we are asking for when we call for charity. In her book, The Political is Political, Conformity and the Illusion of Dissent in Contemporary Political Philosophy, Lorna Finlayson offers a sustained analysis and critique of what she terms the informal norm of philosophic charity. There is, as Finlayson points out, very little work in academic philosophy about the informal norm of charity. So Finlayson sees the work in argumentation theory and informal logic about charity, so she's asking or pointing out the lack of work on this informal norm, this habitual kind of expectation that we offer charity. Finlayson claims that, quote, in the analytic tradition, at least, to describe something as uncharitable is to refuse its recognition as a serious philosophical criticism, end quote. Although I will say in my experience, this assumption that a critique must meet some standard of charitability to count is one that cuts across the analytic-continental divide. I'll see it in continental philosophy framed as hermeneutic generosity. Often that's how it shows up on that end of the discipline. Finlayson's aim is to, quote, and I'm sorry, this is a long one, correct any illusion that this norm of charitability is a neutral referee regulating political philosophical debate according to a methodological principle acceptable to all, an illusion which tends to work to exclude certain kinds of dissent against the status quo from the circle of sanctioned disagreement, end quote. So I share Finlayson's conviction that interpretive charity is not a neutral methodological or interpretive principle. When charitability dominates philosophic discourse, our conversations risk reproducing many of the same harms that we might assume a charitable mode of engagement mitigates or prevents. And this is because what we take as sufficient charitability is inevitably going to be informed by our own philosophical, social, political, and methodological commitments, among many others. Citing charity as merely a rule for argumentation strips argument of all gendered, racialized, and class content and context. And here I was really benefited by Tempest Henning's 2020 paper about argumentative smothering of Black and other racialized scholars. What we view as legitimate or rigorous form of argumentation is often already coded to align with or enforce like white or dominant modes of engaging with the world. And I find her work really, really helpful and illuminating in that way. So when we sort of take charity as this like neutral methodological principle acceptable to all, as Finlayson describes, we're erasing the fact that charity is always relational and always enacted by and in a public. It is not something that I grant to you in my benevolence. It is something that we do together, either because this is part of how we live out God's kingdom on earth, if we're Augustinians about it, or because we've developed a community and taken responsibility and committed to taking those responsibilities really seriously. So charity is political, but we treat it like it's not. Or that's something that I've noticed is kind of seems to be happening habitually across the discipline. I think that our ways of relating to charity's history are part of what allows us to background the political nature of charitability. I've noticed that conversations about charity among non-specialists tend to go one of two ways, and I'll be interested to see if you all have heard similar things or if you have different experiences here. So on the one hand, it sometimes seems that how we use the term charity does not have much to do with the terms history or etymology. These contemporary uses are, in other words, largely disconnected from the past uses. It's not clear that charity, as we refer to it now, is a form of love at all. We don't usually claim, as Augustine did, that interpretations or arguments that are not rooted in love are wrong, or that those that are rooted in love can't be wrong. Offering a text or an interlocutor the benefit of the doubt could be an act of love, but it could also be an example of willful or pernicious ignorance, thinking again about Henning's work here. Providing the best possible interpretation of an argument could be an act of love, but it could also be a way of arguing with one's own rendering of an argument that didn't previously exist, rather than with one's own original conversation partner. And reconstructing an argument charitably in order to criticize it could be an act of love, but it could also be a strategy for excluding arguments that fall too far outside the philosophical status quo, or it could be a strategy for getting our students to quit asking us about Aristotle's sexism or his defense of slavery, because we really got to move on to the virtue stuff. That's one that I kind of hear frequently. My point is this: charity's emergence as a rule of conduct for criticism seems to have a tenuous relationship with caritas or with agape. It is not only that we rarely historicize the term when requesting charity from others or in practicing it ourselves. It is also the case that reading love back into these contemporary examples seems like an anachronistic distortion of what they're really kind of doing or how they're really functioning today. So that's what's happening on the one hand that I'm noticing. On the other hand, occasionally philosophers do make mention of charity's etymology. I'm fairly regularly reminded of the connection between charity and the Latin caritas. Oh, and I see that there's something about civic friendship, and I have so many questions about civility as well, so hope to explore that in a little bit. So fairly regularly, I'll be reminded of the connection between charity and the Latin caritas. My interlocutors take this connection between the terms to be significant. We're like, oh, did you know that charity comes from the Latin caritas? In my least charitable moments, I wonder whether they're informing me of charity's etymology, not because they believe that connecting it back to caritas is important, but because they're defending potential challenges to charity by claiming that caritas is canonically and methodologically like highly precedented, so we don't need to be asking further questions about charitability. But when I'm feeling more charitable, I understand this reminder as part of a set of charitable habits that philosophers learn. It's not that they question whether charitability is appropriate in a given circumstance. It is rather that it's really hard to conceive of a legitimate philosophical situation in which charity is unwarranted. One might, upon learning of charity's connection to love, be relieved to know that their or the discipline's way of interpreting the world is connected to such a powerful positive affect. This, though, is precisely the impulse that I worry about. My concern is that equating charity and love, but then failing to be specific about the content and the obligations of that love, contributes to upholding the status of charity as a seemingly apolitical or neutral philosophical method. All right, to summarize so far, charity is political. There's no way to call for charitable interpretation without also making an implicit claim about how publics ought to interact, communicate, and argue. Despite the political nature and rich history of charity, the concept is not historically grounded or examined in detail, or not often. Or if you all have examples of when it is, I would love to see them. But charity is, we seem to think, required for good philosophy. Now, the fact that philosophers don't typically historicize charity in this way is not surprising, and in some ways I don't blame us for that. Offering a detailed historical account of a methodological principle every time we use it is impractical, particularly since we are often using charity to get somewhere else in the text or in the argument. It's a way to kind of set the stage or set the grounds and then kind of move on from there. But when we take charitably as a universally appropriate argumentative strategy, we can find ourselves calling for charity almost reflexively, almost unthinkingly. Kant's racist anthropology, read him charitably. Aristotle's view that women can't be virtuous, read him charitably. Anything about Heidegger, I will hear calls for charity quite often. I could go on with examples, but I think y'all kind of like see where I'm going with this. The problem with cases like the ones that I'm describing, where we're kind of demanding charity without really thinking about what the content of that demand entails, is that we are often also demanding that our interlocutor enter or remain in what Gil Polhaus Jr., drawing from Maria Lugones, calls an unjust world of sense. Polhaus argues in a 2011 paper that when a marginalized person is asked to perform an act of understanding that would require them to remain in or travel to an unjust or oppressive world, their epistemic agency, the subject's epistemic agency, is being problematically curtailed. Even if they're not forced to agree with the view presented, the request to kind of take this argument seriously and charitably sometimes requires one to, quote, participate within the world that gives sense to what is to be understood, end quote. So if I say to one of the women in my class, okay, I know that Aristotle has this like quite misogynistic account of gender over here, but you should extend him some charity as you read him. Think about the time that he was writing in. I have not only foreclosed an opportunity for thinking carefully about a whole host of fascinating philosophical questions that feminist philosophers have been writing about for decades, I've also forced that student to take seriously a world in which she, as a woman, is thought to be incapable of the kind of virtue and excellence that men have access to. This curtailment of agency is something that Gil Polhaus calls an epistemic violence, particularly because it is asymmetrically enacted. Marginalized people are disproportionately asked to perform these acts of understanding. In cases like these, a refusal to understand is justified, a refusal to step into that world where your oppression or your marginalization is coherent, makes sense. Polhaus says is justified. These refusals, she says, protect one's epistemic agency, they interrupt unjust epistemic habits of others, and they gesture toward possible other worlds. In fact, she'll say, sometimes calling attention to an injustice requires stepping outside of the world in which that injustice makes sense. Over-relying on the call for charity in philosophy basically traps us in unjust worlds that we cannot think our way out of precisely because we're trapped. And Tepes Henning, again, makes a related point in her 2020 paper, explaining that racialized academics often face this when they face argumentative smothering. So, in this paper, I have argued that contemporary calls for charity tend to disguise the fact that charity is always already political. Highlighting the etymology helps us see that and adjust accordingly. I have offered my own brief etymological history and claim that philosophers who do not specialize in charity tend to either ignore that history altogether or gesture to it without sufficiently attending to what caritas or agape require of us. Love, in short, doesn't seem to play much of a role in our contemporary charitability habits and practices. I've been thinking about two ways forward, and this is by far the least developed part of my talk, so I'm really interested to hear your all's reactions and feedback here. So one option could be a return to caritas. Maybe we go back to the Augustinian roots of it all. Joel Weinsheimer writes that, quote, all interpretation is charitable interpretation. Interpretations are for him not critical, not even criticism. And he's working in a tradition of Gadamersian hermeneutics. So her interpretations are not critical, not even criticism. Perhaps they are better called uncritical. However, I would rather call them charitable, recalling the etymology of the word. Charitable interpretation is an expression of caritas, love of literature. And he's an English scholar, I believe, so that's where he's kind of going. So Weinsheimer here claims that charity is not merely one among many available modes of interpreting. Indeed, it is not even a special or privileged way of interpreting that the interpreter should be attracted to by its ethical pull, or part of a dialectical relationship between faithful and suspicious reading. Instead, charitable interpretation is more fundamental. For Weinsheimer, it is what makes understanding a communication possible in the first place. Weinsheimer calls his view charity militant. One must, if they want to understand the text they are reading or the person they're talking to, interpret them charitably. Again, this must is not moral. Instead, Weinsheimer characterizes charity as a hermeneutic a priori. It is what lays the groundwork or the ground for dialogue and disagreement. And this might sound familiar to folks who know about the Donald Davidson kind of philosophy of language, called flavor type of charitability here. Interestingly, for my purposes here, to claim charitability as a hermeneutic a priori is also, in effect, to claim that love is a hermeneutic a priori. So here, the political nature of charity, or more accurately of caritas, is kind of plainly in view for Weinsheimer. So that's maybe one way to move forward, is really turning fully back toward this caritas, this love of community or fellow citizens. Another option that we have, I think, is maybe we can pluralize the kinds of love we talk about when we talk about charity. Bring love back into our conversations about interpretation, argumentation, communication, but of a different kind. Charitable love is only one form of love. Indeed, if we have a more particularized account of love and its object, we might be able to avoid some of the problems with charity. I'm going to offer Christy Dotson's account of radical love as a generative and contextualized example of, though not a replacement for, centering love as an interpretive or a methodological tool. So if we're going to take seriously the term's connection to love, but maybe like go in a slightly different direction with it, I think that Dotson's work here is really, really interesting. So in her essay, Radical Love, Black Philosophy as Deliberate Acts of Inheritance, Dotson claims that doing Black philosophy, particularly Black feminist philosophy, requires the philosopher to demonstrate radical love for Black people. Her radical love is one that, quote, I have it here, takes a steadfast commitment to centering Black women, an unwavering trust that such centering will reap theoretical fruit, and a willingness to stake these claims in the face of many who would find my orientation, quite frankly, ludicrous, end quote. So here Dotson's discussing the importance not only of citing Black feminist theorists, but also of trusting that those citations are going to be generative for her philosophy. And obviously, I'm not saying here that the answer is replace all calls for charity with calls for Dotson's radical love, because doing that, making that move would rip Dotson's methodological commitment from the context in which it's embedded. But it is one example that I have found really helpful to think with. In moments when I'm really frustrated with charity or how it's operating in contexts where people don't really have a lot of familiarity with charity or charitability, I find it helpful to remember that there are multiple traditions of interpretation, communication, and argumentation that do center love, but do not center charity in quite the same way. So in this talk, I've articulated some problems that I see with contemporary ahistorical calls for charity in academic philosophy. I've pointed out that charity is political, and that when we ignore this, we risk perpetuating epistemic violence and oppression. Finally, I've offered two paths. I don't know if paths out is quite the language I want to use here, but two ways that we might move forward. Recenter caritas in our calls for charity, or think beyond the love that charity typically connotes in favor of a context-specific love. I've got lots of questions and concerns about both paths, but I'm at potentially over my self-imposed time. So I will wrap it up with just a couple of questions that I'm still kind of thinking through or not satisfied with. And so I would love to hear, obviously, the questions that y'all have, but then also if you could help me answer these, that would be great. So first, what have I missed, either about charity's etymology or charity's uses in philosophy today? I was already seeing some things pop up in the chat, so excited to kind of delve in there. I'm also not an Augustine scholar, and so if anyone here on the call is or knows a lot about Augustine, please give me your wisdom. Second, are there resources in argumentation theory that do this historicizing work, or that could help me do it better? Third, and finally, I just the other day reread a paper by Nora Berenstain about the etymological history and colonial violence of the word civility. And so I'm wondering here, like, are there important connections between criticism of calls for civility with criticisms of calls for charity that I'm making here? Or in other words, is my problem actually with a call for civility and not with a call for charity? So I don't know. But I will leave it there. And thank you so much for y'all's time. And I'm really excited to have some discussion.